Let's talk about one of the most famous stories in the world. You've got a global flood, a gigantic boat, and one single family picked to survive and, restart all of humanity. It's a story that's baked into our culture. But what if I told you the version you know isn't the first one?
Yeah, you know the one I'm talking about. A good man named Noah gets a heads up from God that a world-ending flood is on its way. He builds this massive ark, rounds up 2 of every animal, and he and his family just float away while the rest of the world gets washed clean. It's a classic, right? A story of judgment, but also of salvation.
Well, here's where it gets really interesting. Long before the biblical story was ever written down, people in ancient Mesopotamia were telling a story that was, honestly, almost identical. Their heroes had different names, sure, guys like Utnapishtim, Ziusudra, Atrahasis, but they were playing the exact same part, the one guy who builds a boat and survives a flood sent by the gods. So, the fascinating part isn't just that the stories are similar, it's how they're different. The big picture is the same, but when you zoom in on the details, that's where things get really revealing. It's kind of like finding 2 different blueprints for the same incredible building. The small changes tell you everything about who drew them up and why.
Okay, let's start with the ship itself, the Ark. In the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, the hero Utnapishtim is told to build his boat as a perfect cube. Now, anybody who knows anything about boats knows a cube would be a disaster on the water, just spinning around. This tells us the design was probably more symbolic, right? Maybe it represented the 4 corners of the world. But Noah's Ark, it's described as a long rectangular barge. It's a practical design. It's meant to float. One is all about cosmic symbolism, the other is just about trying to survive.
And what about the passenger list? Who actually got on board? In the Bible, it's a super exclusive group, just Noah and his immediate family. That's it, 8 people. But the Mesopotamian Ark, it's like a whole town gets saved. You've got the hero's family, his extended relatives, all the local craftsmen, even the guy steering the boat. This shows a totally different way of looking at the world. The Bible story is focused on saving a single righteous family line. The Mesopotamian one is about saving the very fabric of a community, the people with the skills to rebuild society.
And check this out, this is a brilliant little detail. Both stories have that iconic scene where the hero sends out birds to see if there's dry land, but they do it in the opposite order. Utnapishtim sends out a dove, then a swallow, and saves the tough, hardy raven for last. Noah does the complete reverse. He sends the raven out first. And as the scholar Alexander Hedel pointed out, Noah's way actually makes a lot more sense. You send out the toughest bird first, the one that can survive on its own, before you risk the more delicate ones. It's a small change, but it speaks volumes.
Okay, so we've got these 2 stories. They're incredibly similar, but they've got these really specific, meaningful differences. The parallels are just way too close for it to be a coincidence. So that leaves us with the million-dollar question, what's the connection here? How are these stories related? Well, scholars have been arguing about this for more than 100 years, and they've basically landed on 3 main theories. Think of it like a literary detective case.
So here are the 3 big possibilities. 1. The biblical story came first and the Mesopotamians copied it. 2. The other way around. The Bible borrowed the story from Mesopotamia. Or 3. Maybe both stories are just different versions of a much older tale that they both got from a common source.
All right, let's look at theory 1, the idea that the Bible's version is the original. This one runs into a pretty massive roadblock right out of the gate, and that roadblock is time. The oldest Mesopotamian flood tablets we found date back to around 2000 BC. The book of Genesis, where we find Noah's story, is generally thought to be written down much later. So on paper, the Mesopotamian texts are just flat out older.
But hold on, not so fast. A scholar named A.T. Clay came up with this brilliant analogy. He said, look, just because you find an older copy of a story somewhere doesn't prove it started there. Finding an old German translation of Shakespeare in Berlin doesn't mean Shakespeare was German, right? Clay argued that maybe both stories came from an even earlier legend, a Semitic one that both the Mesopotamians and the Israelites later adapted in their own ways.
Okay, on to theory 2. This is the one you'll hear most often, and it's based on that hard evidence of the dates. The idea is simple. The Hebrews borrowed their flood story from the older Mesopotamian culture. For a long time, this was pretty much the standard view among scholars. It just seemed to make the most sense.
But this theory has a big problem too. If the biblical writers were just copying the story, why is the whole vibe, the whole theology, so radically different? Alexander Hedel said it best. The skeleton of the story is the same, sure, but the flesh and blood, and most importantly, the spirit, are completely different.
In the Mesopotamian version, the gods are just annoyed because humans are being too loud. They're acting like cranky neighbors. But in the biblical account, you have a single god acting for a moral reason against a world filled with corruption. That's not just borrowing, that's a total reinvention.
And that brings us to Theory 3, which a lot of modern scholars lean towards. People like Gerhard von Rad suggested that we don't have to assume one copied the other directly. It's actually more likely that both the Bible and the Babylonian stories are independent versions of a single, shared tradition that's even older than both of them. It's like they're two different branches that grew from the same ancient tree trunk.
So if there is a common ancestor story, that opens up a whole new can of worms. Does that mean there was a real, historical flood? Some kind of massive cosmic experience that got burned into the memory of ancient peoples? Or is this just a really, really good story that went viral thousands of years ago?
Now, on the one hand, you find flood myths all over the planet, in cultures that had no contact with each other. That feels like powerful evidence for some kind of shared memory of a real event. But here's a fantastic counterpoint. Anthropologists bring up other stories, like a folktale called The Magic Flight, where a hero escapes a monster by throwing things behind him that magically turned into obstacles. That story is also found all over the globe, and it's also ancient and surprisingly uniform. But nobody thinks it's based on a real event. It just goes to show that a really compelling story can spread like wildfire across cultures all on its own.
So we might never be able to prove whether a single great flood actually happened, but what we can trace is the story's impact. And this is where the biblical version takes a sharp turn, one that has had massive real-world consequences. We need to shift gears and talk about what happens after the water goes down, because this is where the story's legacy gets really complicated, becoming both a symbol of hope and a weapon of oppression.
So first, the hopeful part. After the flood, God makes a promise, not just to Noah, but to all life on earth. It's called the Noahic Covenant, and in it, he vows to never, ever destroy the world with a flood again. And the sign of this promise? A rainbow in the clouds.
But the peace doesn't last long. The story takes a very strange turn. Noah plants a vineyard, gets drunk, and passes out in his tent. His son, Ham, sees him and does something that's seen as deeply disrespectful, and then goes and tells his brothers about it. When Noah wakes up, he's furious. But he doesn't curse Ham. Instead, he places a terrible curse on Ham's son, Canaan, saying he will be a servant to his brothers.
And this one, really difficult passage has been used to justify absolute horror. For centuries, this story was twisted and contorted to become a biblical argument for slavery. Pro-slavery advocates made this completely unfounded leap, claiming that black Africans were the descendants of Ham, and therefore this curse on Canaan meant they were destined by God to be slaves.
Let's be perfectly clear. That entire interpretation is baseless. As the anthropologist J.R. Buswell III puts it in our source material, the arguments that used this story to justify slavery were, in his exact words, utterly fantastic. And he means fantastic in the sense of being pure fantasy. It was a complete and horrific misreading of a text to prop up a monstrous institution. And that really brings us back to the beginning, doesn't it? The incredible journey of this one story, from its Mesopotamian origins to its radical retelling in the Bible, and then to its tragic misuse centuries later, it shows us something incredibly important. Stories aren't just words on a page. They travel, they change, they get reinterpreted, and they can be used for good or for evil. It really makes you think, what does this long, complicated history teach us about the responsibility we have for the stories we choose to tell and believe today?